Hello, my name is Angelica Mendoza. I am Business Development Manager at Effective, the translation and localization company, and I'm going to be the moderator of this webinar. It is called Practical Aspects of Modern Machine Translation, from Navigating Common Myths to Post-Editing, and is the second in our series of webinars on practical application of modern translation, localization, and interpretation technologies. The webinar will be conducted by Stepan Gorotayev, our CTO and Head of Research and Development. During the webinar, your mics and cameras will be switched off, but you can type in questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll address your questions during a dedicated Q&A session at the end of our webinar. During the webinar, we'll run several short polls to better understand our audience and its needs. We'll be very grateful if you take a minute to participate in these polls. It'll help us in developing future webinars, addressing more specific needs and use cases. Please note that this session will be recorded and then sent to all participants for future reference. And now I'll hand it over to Stepan.
Thanks, Angie. Hi, folks. As Angie mentioned, my name is Stepan, and I'll be your host today. So let's jump straight in and start with our company. We're a translation, localization, interpretation company with a very strong focus on R&D, including machine translation. We're also focused on partnerships, and that allows us to create solutions for complex and unique needs of our clients. I put some of it on the slide. And I know that this is probably the most boring part of any presentation when you're forced to hear someone bragging about their successes. So let's just make it a bit more engaging. And let me run our first poll today to learn slightly more about our audience. And of course, I'd appreciate it if you could take a second to participate, maybe a couple of seconds. So let me run this poll. So who do you work for, right? Who do you work for? On relaunch poll. Continue. Okay, so sorry for this technical glitch. Okay, so this is our poll and sounds a bit threatening, but it's not about mafia, it's about your organization. So please share. And I'll give us maybe 30 seconds to complete it. Yeah, I'll keep it up for a while. And I can see that it's going really well. So thank you all for taking part in our poll. Okay, so maybe a couple more seconds. Maybe 5 seconds. Okay, I'm closing it and poll. And I'll share the results. Here they are. So mostly people from translation companies and also from large businesses. And we also have independent researchers and consultants. Always nice to have you folks. So thanks for coming. Okay, so I'll stop sharing. Right. Let's close it. And let's go to the next slide. So which is our agenda today? And again, you can read through it, but I know that agenda slides are not that super exciting either. So let me run another poll for your entertainment only. Okay, so let me just run it another poll, 2 polls in a row, and I promise only one to come and much later. So let me ask you, what's your role in your organization? Again, several options. So please take a second and tell us about your role. And if you have questions now or later, you can always ask them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll add background and dedicate more time to this in the end during a Q&A session. But you don't need to wait until then. All right, so just type your question in whenever you feel up to it. Okay, so here are our results, and maybe I'll keep it up, just a little longer, because I can see that answers keep flowing in, so maybe a bit longer. Okay, so let's end this and share results. And again, a lot of dedicated localization managers, which is always, again, very nice to see you guys and girls. So let me close it. Stop sharing. All right. And let's move to our first substantial slide. And this is the current state of machine translation. And let me go through it briefly. I know that many of you are pretty experienced with all this, so I don't need to tell you some trivial facts, but let me just cover some major bases. So as many of you probably know, neural machine translation has won this battle, and in a very decisive manner. And if you heard about rule-based or statistical models even a few years ago, I don't think you've heard much about them lately. A very significant feature of today's empty landscape is, of course, the abundance of providers. Again, on the surface, many people think that starts with Google and maybe ends with Microsoft or Amazon as leading machine translation providers. But in fact, there are dozens of companies, large and small, and there is no one single certified best solution for all language pairs, subject matters, et cetera, et cetera. You always need to test, always need to watch for new developments and try different approaches to ensure best results. Another very important aspect of modern machine translation is so-called training. In simple words, it means that you can increase your machine translation quality by feeding your model linguistic data that are specific to your product domain, brand style, etc. And if you're a company with an array of previously translated materials, so for example, your website is in different languages, or you have user manuals or help documentation in different languages, then you already have this data. And of course, to make it useful for the purposes of training, you need to first clean and prepare your data. But once you have it in one form or the other, you're already there. So it's half battle won. So let's now move to the next slide and talk about some other aspects. Machine translation systems exist in different shapes and forms, as again, many of you, I'm sure, well know. So the most affordable and easily accessible form is translation services on the web. It's free. You can just paste your text there and get your translation almost immediately. And the most recognizable example is probably still Google Translate, but similar functionality is currently available with many other providers. So let's take a look on the next slide. Just an example, a very well-known empty system called DeepL, which is widely used for European languages. I just pasted my text here, as you can see, and got my translation next to it. So it's free, it's very quick, but it's more suited for a casual user, as you can see. So for any machine translation to work efficiently in a corporate setting, it must be integrated into workflows, into your workflows. You cannot rely on copy pasting. You cannot copy paste a huge PDF file containing your user manual or whatever, and then get it back formatted and everything. So you can't put it here. Or imagine a software built with all its UI strings. You can copy those strings one by one. It's getting pretty old pretty quickly. So another very important consideration is confidentiality, and you can see it on the slide. So your data are exposed when you use these free online services. In most cases, they do not offer any safeguards. So whatever you send Google's way can be used by Google if you resort to their web service. So, and of course, you're violating your NDAs with your customers, and just something that you can't afford, especially as large business. So these web translators are more of a toy than a real tool when we talk about incorporating MT into some serious workflows. But it's it's very important. This toy can become dangerous. It's not just a toy in your hands. It can become very dangerous and undermine many of your efforts when it's used by by other actors in your translation or localization workflow. So, for example, your translators. So for now, let's just keep it in mind. I'll circle back to it later, but it's a very important detail. So aside from these ubiquitous free online machine translation tools, we find ourselves in front of a really diverse picture. So here's a chart published by Intenta, a very well-known industry organization. It's part of their annual study on machine translation, where, by the way, we were one of the partners in that study, and I can highly recommend it. So go get it if you haven't yet. So what we see here are stock models, meaning pre-trained models that you can do much with except for using them as they are. But also we can see models supporting training, open source models that you can try and deploy on your own if you have capabilities and personnel for that. Various approaches to terminology management and model adaptation training. So it's like entering this door, knowing that there is this thing called Google Translate and the world is spinning as usual, but then suddenly you're falling into this rabbit hole with all this plethora of options. And there is no single solution for a random problem. So you just need to be able to be flexible. So otherwise your results will be less than satisfactory in very many cases. So, okay, so a bit more on the confidentiality problem that I mentioned earlier. Here I just took a page, quite literally, from our onboarding guide for customers wanting to implement some kind of machine translation workflow on their side. A lot of considerations, as you can see. But the good thing is that when you work with enterprise-oriented machine translation systems, you have various safeguards in place. You can even go as far as installing everything within your own perimeter on your servers. It's going to cost you, and overall is much less flexible than using cloud, but you can do that if you want to. And even if you go with cloud, you have much more detailed agreements and levels of protection to keep your data safe. So corporate accounts, corporate agreements are very important to protect your data and to keep you on the safe side. And all that somewhat tangentially brings us to the problem of price, right? So indeed, all these options we've just seen, capability of integration in your workflows, high level of confidentiality, it must cost something, doesn't it? Yeah, and yeah, it does. I'm not sure if you can read this chart with confidence. And again, this chart is from our partner study with Intenta, but it's a very large spectrum of prices. Usually you're charged by character, and all outliers aside, it's around $20 per million characters. But it all depends on your volumes and other specifics of your usage. But in any case, it's very important to understand that this is, whatever it is, it's just a fraction of your cost. You'll need to post edit on top of all this, and more about it later. You'll need training, and custom trained models are normally more expensive than baseline models. You'll need data preparation, terminology management, et cetera, et cetera. So going back to the question, is MT really cheap? So let me put it this way. It's in most cases, it's cheaper than other approaches, but its main value is in its scalability and versatility rather than pure price. With a proper MT workflow, you can do things so much faster and scale up your production very quickly. That's the main benefit. So in a day, you can have more words translated using machine translation than all the translators in the world could do in a year, so combined. So that's the main value of this technology. You can do things very fast, and scale up your processes. And now let me run our last poll today. It's going to be about how you're implementing machine translation in your current workflows, if of course you do. So let me run this poll. Launch. Okay, so here it is. Have you implemented machine translation in your processes? And again, I'd appreciate your time if you could participate in this short poll. right? All right, so probably this is it. Maybe maybe some more votes. No, okay. So I end it and share results. Yes. Okay, so again, very experienced audience with a lot of a lot of things about machine translation. So I'll try to keep my basic facts as brief as possible, not to bore you. Okay, let me stop sharing this. And let's move further. Okay, so now let's consider some of the misconceptions about machine translation, and there are very many, as many of you know. So MT as business, and very much overhyped at times, had been around for many years before neural networks came to the fore and really changed the game. And many people had tried it and felt cheated. I mean, tried it before because, well, let's be honest, it wasn't that good on average. So on average, these old models sometimes were very disappointing, but they were hyped as a silver bullet and the solution for all the translation problems. So many people felt cheated, and this attitude has somehow carried over to even modern, much more advanced systems. But rejecting machine translation now on the grounds of this old attitude would definitely be a mistake. So on the other hand, machine translation is not a silver bullet either. It's not going to solve everything for every business or market or product. It is what it is, an incredibly powerful tool that any translation localization program should have in its arsenal. But it's not an infinity stone, not by any means. And let me elaborate on some of these misconceptions, moving to our next slides. So metrics, what are those? It's a way to measure quality of our machine translation model, in most cases comparing its output to a so-called reference data set. The idea here is that we have some human translations and we give our model same source sentences, and it learns to produce output which we measure, comparing it to our reference translation. The closer it is, the better. So we measure our model before a training session, then after the session. And if a metric has gone up, which means our machine translation is now closer in some ways to our reference human translation, then big success, kudos to us, mission accomplished. You can already see some of the shortcomings of this approach. First of all, who said that our reference translations are any good? I mean, how do you know? It's a huge, large data set. How do you know? And if you train your model to become increasingly more similar to a not so good reference translation, then what's the purpose of it? Then there is this problem that you can very often say the very same thing in different ways. And why penalize a model if its way is somewhat different from our reference way? And this latter problem is addressed in more advanced metrics to a degree, but it's still a problem. And then on top of all that, the most important question, we try to bring our model closer to what we perceive as human translation, but who said the translation you think is human produced really is? Remember those free online translators earlier that I showed you on one of the previous slides? You've been sending your texts for translation to your translators for years, and being clever, they learn to optimize and to use technology to speed up their work. And I'm not saying that all of them do that, but you'd be surprised to learn how many. To such a degree that we even had to develop a methodology, in-house methodology, to identify unsanctioned machine translation in our own workflows. The point is, you may think that your data set is purely human translated, but it can be 80% Google translated. And now you're trying to teach a different model. So say you selected Microsoft as your system, and you're trying to train it, but In fact, what you're trying to do, you're trying to make it closer to Google, which is, well, you thought it was your human reference, but in fact, it is your Google reference, because your translators over the years have used Google to translate texts that you've been sending them. But I mean, it sounds absurd, but that's what might easily happen if you don't pay attention. And all your metrics will go up and you'll be happy with your rapid advancement, but you could just switch to Google right away and stop wasting your time and money, or to any other model, of course. So Microsoft, Google here are just as an example. That being said, metrics, of course, are useful. They're important. They are your compass in a way. A lot of clever people invest their time and researching effort in trying to make them better and figuring out new ways to evaluate texts based on different criteria. But metrics are not enough as your only mechanism to control quality of your model. So it's very important to understand that. Another interesting topic is how MT stacks up against us, humans. And I've touched on this already. 15 years ago, we saw something stylistically ugly or outright nonsensical, and we yelled, machine translation, busted, got you. But now your translators are using it, and very many of them, and little by little, their style, even when they try to work on their own without asking for help from the machine, their style is changing. You can say that they train their own brains just like we train our models. And on the other side, on the buyer's side, on your side, expectations are also changing, because you too are being subjected to an overwhelming incoming flow of machine translation. Sometimes you know that it is machine translation. Sometimes you don't know that. You think it's human translation. But in any case, it's coming at you and you're adjusting. We're not so sure anymore. Is it the machine? Maybe post-edited translation? Or is it just a new norm? I'm just being too picky, trying to find something that is not there. So another interesting concept is so-called human parity. Conceptually, it means that your machine translation in its raw form right after your model is as good as human translation, hopefully. Okay, so if it's as good, then this human parity is achieved. What is meant by as good as is that if you give a large enough sample of machine and human translations to an independent reviewer, hopefully qualified enough, this person won't be able to tell the difference. So it's a kind of Turing test. The machine should prove to be indistinguishable from a human. In reality, though, experiments like this are very shaky and hard to verify and replicate. So for some texts, more technical stuff with less ambiguity, variance, a large amount of predictable structures, like user help, for example. Machine translation can be very, very similar to human output. And this parity can be even verified. But in most cases, experiments are too narrow and don't hold water when we start looking at real life cases. But most importantly, I'd say machine translation just should not be compared directly to human translation. So this very concept of comparing them is somewhat flawed. It's just a different animal. It can coincide with human output. It can deviate from it, but it'll never be the same. It's just different. Even though it can and does replace human translation in many cases, but it's different. And these are two different products, two different services. They shouldn't be the same. On the other hand, again, as I mentioned, the line between human translation and machine translation is getting blurrier and blurrier. So maybe this mythical parity is achievable after all, but not because MT has become as good as human translation, but rather because at some point, we just won't be able to separate the two of them at all. So they'll just become identical at some neutral territory between these two approaches. Okay, so just to summarize, here are some of the indications that you should jump on this MT bandwagon right away, or you're really hurting yourselves and your budget. And some language combinations will work better than others. Sometimes you will have all the data for training you need, readily available for you, and sometimes you need to work for the data. But if you need to enter new markets quickly, if you have short release times, a lot of more technical documentation, just go for it. And please take note of this last point in red. I mean, you might be thinking, it's not about my translators. They're working so hard. They keep my product afloat. It's not a good time to change horses in midstream. Let's keep going with them. No machine translation in my tool set. And maybe you're right, okay? But what if whatever you're getting from your translators is already almost totally machine translated, maybe slightly post-edited? Just think about it. So if it is so, it's not a bad thing. It means machine translation works for you. It has been working for you for a while. You just didn't know that, and now that you know, well, not right now, but when you know, you just embrace this reality and well, go for it. Cut your costs. Nothing in your way. You just need to understand where you are and what a good strategy would be. Okay, so moving forward, a couple of words on where exactly you can implement machine translation in your localization workflow. So if it's localization, again, translation, localization, often used interchangeably, though these are very different things. But imagine we have this localization workflow on your side. And of course, this whole thing merits a separate webinar. But in a nutshell, unlike the old approach, when everybody waited for the localization to catch up, and with machine translation as a very useful tool, there is a more agile approach now, often called continuous localization, where you can keep abreast with the development efforts, with your localization efforts. You can start as early as a design stage. You can, so for example, you have text on your buttons, and you need to know where it will end up after a new language, supposedly with potentially longer words is applied. So does it look okay? Or maybe some of your buttons are now truncated. I mean, text on these buttons. You can do this before you even start coding anything. So, and similarly at the development stage, you can constantly send your UI strings back and forth, thanks to the integration between, say, GitHub and the translation system of your provider or of your own. So it's really a self-sustained cycle where everything moves in sync. As a quick example, let's take a look at the design stage I mentioned. So this is where your designer draws screens for your mobile app, for instance. In most cases, it's done with a particular language in mind, I mean, human language, not a programming language, like English, for example. But all sorts of things might happen once your interface is translated. So longer sentences, as I mentioned, truncations of various kinds, different data formats, right to left languages like Arabic, etc., etc. So it's really useful when you can get a grip on this as quickly as possible. So, and by the way, if you don't know what a CAT system is, this is the last bullet on my slide, let us know after the webinar, and we'll be happy to help you with that. So it's not a real cat, but a very important concept in the translation industry that you need to know about. So let me run this little video now where I basically just created a simple screen in Figma, one of the well-known design tools, and then send the strings to MemSource, which is a translation system, a CAT system for immediate machine translation. Of course, this stuff requires some setting up in advance, but let me just run it. So just a video. Okay, so we have several UI elements here, and they have some text on them. So I just sent all these strings for translation, selecting the appropriate template. It's called Figma here. Spanish is my target language. And I'm just getting my translated strings back from MemSource when they're ready, just in a couple of seconds, back into my environment without ever leaving Figma. I'm not going anywhere, just staying here and waiting for my strings. And Let me see. Yeah, here they are. And here they are in the Spanish view. And when I switch to this view, I can see how my UI elements look like when they are translated. And they look okay. In this case, it was just machine translation. So it can be good, it can be not so good, but it helps you understand how your strings, how your UI elements will look like in a different language. It's very, very useful in many scenarios and helps you save a lot of time and effort later on. So it was just a quick demo of one of the possible scenarios. Okay, so let's move on, and a bit on inclusion. So we'll know that it's very important, paramount, to make your content accessible to all people who might need it. And when we talk about translation, very often we're talking about compromises, given tight deadlines, right? The degree of visibility that is needed, budget considerations, et cetera, et cetera. And machine translation, of course, is also a compromise. But it is a compromise that you should be willing to make when it comes to serving your customers. Because if your product is about chatbots, call centers, or online help, or other means of direct communication with your customer, and you can help them use your product, even at the expense of 100% stylistic quality and clarity, you should do that. Because people able to read in their own language will, in most cases, forgive you for some occasional mishaps here and there. And if machine translation in itself is not enough, you can include a human, a so-called human in the loop concept, to amend results, which is much faster. So this, in most cases, if your machine translation is not total junk, then it's going to be faster than translating from scratch. Microsoft, for example, has been using raw machine translation for its help pages for ages. Pages for ages, right? And it works well enough for them and for their customers, despite, again, a number of funny translations that are being tweeted around and ridiculed. But on the whole, the system works. Okay, here's a slide on model selection, another important, very important topic. And the landscape, as I mentioned, is very complex. And this is just, again, this is from an intent to study. And this is just a very, very narrow sample of engines already pre-selected from a larger range of models. And for a specific language, specific domain. So it's just later stages in this process. And still, I hope you can see them, these different colored circles in this chart, which denote different machine translation systems. So it's in one domain, it's going to be one system that performs better, and a different one in the other domain. And so it's all very important and at the same time pretty time consuming. But you need to invest in it, or better yet, outsource it if you don't have resources or competences in-house, because it does require expertise and familiarity with different evaluation techniques to be able to pick out the best engine, or at least one of the best engines. And speaking of which, the methodology of human evaluation is also very important. Once you've narrowed your selection to several machine translation systems using metrics that I mentioned and other automated tools, how do you pick out the best? Again, you'll need a human expert for that, to review and compare output from different systems, and maybe you'll need some post-editing for some of these segments, so we could see what kind of changes were needed. And this is a common approach to these problems. So it was used in the intent to study as well. So basically, someone has to review various versions of machine translated segments and choose the one that they think is better. So for example, you have the same source sentence translated by Google, Microsoft, DeepL, other engines, and now your reviewer sees all these versions without knowing which one of them is translated by which engine, and marks the one they like better. And if you use several reviewers, which is the best practice here. You can average their scores and come to some conclusion. This is how it works in most cases, but this methodology is not without its deficiencies, I would say. So for instance, it's just hard for any human reviewer to compare quite similar machine translation outputs and be able to consistently choose the best one out of this set. So the process is prone to becoming way too monotonous and hence random. We have, as a company, we have a slightly different methodology, which makes this task more productive and, as we hope, more reliable by adding more variation into the process. I think we'll dedicate a separate webinar to this important dimension. Okay. And yet another very important aspect is terminology, right? So consistency in terminology is key to your brand voice and your technical documentation as well. So on the whole, this problem of terminology, of course, exists separately from machine translation. It is relevant regardless of how you translate, in which way you translate. Do you use machine translation or not? Maybe you don't translate at all, or just author your content. So you still need to keep terminology problems in mind. However, what can we say about the terminology problem in the context of machine translation? And the first thing to know is that you can't literally teach your model terminology by just feeding it a glossary, even if you have one. So it's a separate problem again. So do you have a glossary? If you don't, you need to invest in it because it's very important. But suppose you have, so you cannot just feed it your model. You can technically use a glossary with increasingly more empty systems, but the glossary translations are just superimposed over the machine translation output. So you have some output, and imagine a language with a lot of with reaching declensions, for example, like Slavic languages, where words have different forms in different syntactic structures, for example, and these forms will be caught by your model and will be rendered correctly. But then you superimpose your initial forms from your glossary, and it can create a lot of trouble because someone will have to go over this text and to change all these initial forms to their grammatical forms, depending on the grammar and the structure of the sentence. And if you use a glossary in this way, it creates a lot of minor typo-like mistakes, right? So kind of proofreading task, but it may require a lot of time to correct. It doesn't mean that glossaries can be used, of course, but they are very important. But again, it's not a silver bullet. And a more sustainable approach would be to keep training your model on new data or modified old data, just making sure that all this data is terminologically consistent. And again, it requires a lot of work. Just imagine a glossary of 700 entries, and there can be more. And this glossary needs to be checked in a data set of several 100,000 segments, possibly. So it's a huge matrix, a lot of work. So outsource it whenever you can, but it's something that you need to do to stand a good chance of having increasing results with your training. And after all this praise and talk about how empty is, you can do without it, but we ended up with this slide, right? But I'd say that most of these contraindications can be overcome, in fact. So don't shut yourself out from machine translation, even if you see familiar problems on this list. The only exception is probably the last bullet, customer requirements prohibiting use of MT. So of course you cannot violate your agreements with your customer, but in most other cases, you can always at least try and see where it leads you. And chances are it will lead you to a better place than where you're now with your localization program. Okay, post-editing. Another crucial topic, a very broad one. And I've already mentioned several times how important it is to include people in your MT processes, human in the loop. So who are them? Who are those mystical post editors? And I call them mystical because everyone seems to be talking about them, but there is still a good deal of confusion about who they are and what they actually do. So let's start with what they do. Post editors are people who amend raw machine translation output to make your text better. They are critical, as raw machine translation in many cases is still far from your quality targets, or would be far at first. And again, it all depends on a myriad of factors, but post-editing as a rule is still needed in very many situations. So it's just a given. So how do post-editors do their job? Are they actually editors just working with machine translation instead of human translation? Or is it a separate craft and totally separate skills needed to do this job? And there are different opinions on this, but my take is that text skills remain the same. The ability to spot mistakes, to keep concentration and focus, to quickly make changes, improving the text, and not vice versa. It's all shared by all good editors, post editors or not. So I don't agree with those who say that like this person is an average editor. Let's them be a post editor instead. So I don't agree with that. The skills remain the same. And still the craft is somewhat different. As we discussed, machine translation is different too. It's a different animal, even as the line is getting less and less visible. Some people might not want to work with machine translation at all. The material may seem, well, way too complicated, too mechanical, rather, lacking in variance, right? Stylistically primitive. That can be, but most people who are hesitant to start their post-editing careers, they are hesitant just because they lack guidance. They're not sure what to do. They don't understand your expectations, and they're not sure if the pay is good enough. And all of these aspects, they need to be managed. I'll be talking more about it moving forward to our next slide. So what about how deeply a post editor should change or amend the machine translation output? And there are several common quality levels. You can see them on the slide. And the post-editing activity has been even codified with an ISO standard in place. But as with most other linguistic activities, like translation or editing, it's not as much about general instructions and style guides, though they are, of course, very important. It's more about your particular expectations in terms of quality, time, price, and your ability to clearly communicate these requirements to your post editors. So you can just say, here is an ISO standard. I need this MT machine translation post edited, all mistakes corrected, and the price is half of what I'd pay for translation from scratch. It should be much more nuanced with several rounds of feedback and constant adjustments. So do you like what you get as a result from your post editor? If not, what else would you want to see? More stylistic changes, less stylistic changes, more attention paid to complex long sentences. What is your quality level? What is your direct customer's quality level and customer? So what are your metrics here? So you need to communicate it, because it's without it you don't stand a chance of building a successful post-editing program. You need to approach this as a process. This is the only way. And briefly on the levels themselves. So raw machine translation means nothing is done by a human, zero post-editing. Light PE post-editing refers to some less significant changes, but it's a totally gray area. To be honest, without your guidance, your post-editors will probably struggle a lot trying to guess where's this boundary between raw MT and light PE. And full PE, well, again, this human parity looms again, but in fact, it just should be governed by your expectations as well. So obviously there shouldn't be any significant mistakes that no meaning mistakes, no factual mistakes, but all the rest is again should be governed and managed. Okay, so now we're in the home stretch of our webinar, and probably this is the most exciting part, isn't it? So how not to get cheated? A very practical question. And the most important pearl of wisdom that I would like to share with you would be, don't cheat yourselves. And you do that if you don't use machine translation. I mean, if you don't use it intentionally of your own volition. So if you just, when it's already used by all your providers. So again, maybe machine translation is not for you, given the restraints or specifics of your program, but whatever your program is, if all of your translators and editors en masse use machine translation without telling you, which can be the case when you start checking, then stop doing this. Embrace this situation and take advantage. And of course, cut off slackers. I mean, a lot of people work incredibly hard in our business, and I give credit where it's due. A lot of translators, editors, post-editors, proofreaders, DTP people, the cream of the crop, and they deserve nothing but praise and admiration. But machine translation, as legit as it has become lately, it's still a very hyped up business. And where is hype, there are always people very keen on making some easy money. Like post editors doing nothing or next to nothing would be one example. Or translators submitting their work as if it was translated by them, whereas in fact, the translation was just copy pasted from a free online translator with all the consequences for quality and confidentiality. So how do you do this? How do you make sure that all the bases are covered? You need to establish procedures for quality assurance or QA, as it is commonly known. And I'll cover this a bit later. But the general message is, don't cheat yourselves of great opportunities. And machine translation is a great opportunity. And of course, don't let others cheat you as well. So taking it down a notch from this pathos, just as an example, here's how we control our post editors. As you can see, we plot charts showing the amount of changes, how extensive they are, and how these changes are distributed along the whole length of a given file, of a given document. It is important because you don't want your post editor to start changing things enthusiastically and then switch to autopilot in the second part of the document. So it's not the right thing to do. And you also want to know how many changes they've made. Were they extensive changes or minor, et cetera, and all this combined gives you a useful snapshot of your current post-editing effort, even without going deeper into your post-edited documents. So of course, to review it and evaluate it in depth, you need to have another human reviewer to take a look and to take this document through various QA procedures, et cetera, but it always costs more. So this human involvement is valuable, but it's always longer, it's more expensive, and you need to be able to monitor your flow on the constant basis without much cost. And this is the way to do it, one of the ways. So of course you need tools to be able to monitor all these parameters. So we've implemented it as a web service, but there are different ways of approaching this. Just be consistent with your quality control and keep your finger on the pulse. Otherwise it might start unraveling pretty soon. Another example of QA measures, quality assurance measures, is this terminology check. This is just a basic terminology check that can be run as a separate step after the document is post-edited. Here it's just an Excel log with found errors. But again, there are many ways of doing this and incorporating this step into your processes. As I mentioned, terminology is really tricky. It requires special attention, from building a glossary to maintaining it to making sure the glossary is followed in any given translated document. So this is your way of making sure that your glossary that you worked so hard to create is followed and not just neglected. Okay, so now we're circling back to this problem of the unsanctioned use of machine translation by your providers. And what should you do, and what can you do about it? I mean, it's not all bad if your translators learned how to speed up their work, right, using machine translation, as long as you're happy with the results. So it's not about punishing your translators. It's more about better understanding where you are, your current position and their current position. If you understand that your current quality is good and it's mostly machine translated already, and you're still yet to implement a structured machine translation program, so it's going on its own without your even knowing it, well, maybe it's time to make some changes and start managing this process instead of sitting this driver's seat to your contractors. So think about confidentiality of your clients, and think about gains you can make by training your models as opposed to settling for the stock baseline output that your translators left to their own devices, scoop from generic services, right? Like maybe Google Translate, some other service. You need to understand where you are and how you want to move forward, and then act, of course. And again, here's just another little example from our practice to identify cases where translators quite possibly use machine translation on their own without telling. We constantly monitor our translation system, and based on a certain algorithm, sample various translated segments once in a while to check if they look like raw machine translation from popular machine translation engines for this language combination. And if they do, an email is generated and sent to a manager, which leads to more thorough investigation and discussion with the translator. So it's just, and then maybe they move from being a translator to being a post editor. So again, it all depends. So maybe the final product is very important. So if you see that your final product is good and your translator arrived at this product by using machine translation, then okay, let's talk machine translation in your post editing role. But if the final product is bad and your translator hasn't added real value, then probably this conversation is going to go in a different direction. So it's just an example of these emails sent to our managers or your QA specialists, or maybe your, I don't know, chief editor or whoever is in charge of this process. Just another example of how you can approach this problem and regain control over your translation process. Okay, so this is it. We arrived at our final slide. This is the time to start our Q&A session. I'm not sure we'll have much time for it today, but we'll certainly answer all your questions. If not now, then later via email or addressing them in our upcoming webinars. Angie, the floor is yours again.
Thank you so much, Stepan. Well, I want to thank you all for coming on behalf of Effective, and we look forward to seeing you in our upcoming webinars. Just before we wrap.
Angie, but could you read up?
Before we wrap, could you elaborate on how terminology works with machine translation?
Okay. Good question. And again, probably it merits a separate webinar. But so when we talk about terminology, we talk about glossaries, and glossaries are pairs of a term in our source language and its translation into our target language. So for example, we might have an English-German glossary with nouns like name, a name, right? Ein Name, so the translation for name. So it's a very simple example just to make the case. And then in English, as we know, it's always a name. So regardless of the sentence structure, I don't have a name, I have a name, she wanted to have a name, etc. So it's the very same initial form of this noun. Whereas in English, in German, there is Declension. And so I don't have a name, ich habe keinen Namen. So it means that this initial form changes in some circumstances. And of course, it will be correctly translated by your machine translation engines. They are good enough to catch that. But then when you superimpose your glossary, and it works this way. So you superimpose your glossary on top of that, and all the forms of this noun Name from your glossary will be replaced with this initial form Name, right? So all Namen will become Name, regardless of the structure of the sentence. And so it will lead to, and imagine, again, Germany is not, it's not an extreme case, but imagine Slavic languages, for example, or other languages with a lot of morphological changes. And in this case, you'll just be faced with a huge task of proofreading your text, because the terms are correct, but their form in which they occur in your translation might be not correct, and you will have to change that. Okay, do we have more questions? And I can see, Angie?
Yes.
Yeah. I can see that a couple of your questions were answered in the background. So about a question about our polling questions. So what do they mean? It was answered. And I missed the first couple of minutes. So will the recording be shared? Yes, definitely. Again, it was answered. So let's probably wrap it up. Angie, for your final word.
Yes. Well, thank you all once again for joining us in this webinar. We certainly look forward to seeing you again in our upcoming webinars. And on behalf of Effective, thank you again for your participation, and have a great rest of your day up ahead. Thank you.